Consider supporting Archaeo-Soup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you. Hello, Rachel and Matt.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hello. Now, I'm laughing, just for those of you at home, because we have been at this for an hour, maybe, trying to get Skype to work today. But for all our efforts, we have been rewarded with the opportunity to talk today about a very interesting and exciting discovery, or I suppose confirmation, some might say, of an Iron Age martial practice. I talk, of course, of the so-called Battersea Shield, and I guess I'd just like to know more about it. So first and foremost, how and when and where did you find it? And actually also, can you introduce yourselves?
Okay, I'll do that one. So yeah, Matt Beamish is my name, and I was the project manager for the post-excavation work from this site. The site was excavated in 2015. And the shield was found in August 2015, so perhaps 4 years ago, on a otherwise pretty communal garden Iron Age site, what looks like a pastoral site, on the west side of the River Soar, which is the river draining South Leicestershire and Central Leicestershire down to the Trent, near its confluence south of Nottingham. Okay. So yeah, that's the kind of bit on that.
And so in that sense, was there any expectation or any hint that this could have been a place where a shield might be found at all?
Absolutely none. No. It's a what would usually be a dry site with nothing wet there. There's a pit alignment. There are bits of metal surfaces and ditches. It looks like a stock handling area, not immediately an area of occupation, and it's a free key survival in a very big pit. Which is how we have the shield, really. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And what about you, Rachel? What's your way? How did you become involved in this particular artifact?
So my name is Rachel Crellin, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Leicester in the School of Archaeology and Ancient History. So Matt and I work in the same building. And just over a year ago, I guess, Matt contacted me and said, well, I hear you do some stuff with weapons and some experimental stuff, which is true. I am really a Bronze Age specialist, not an Iron Age specialist. And I've done experimental work with swords and spears and shields and stuff like that, looking at how they can be used and how they were used in prehistory. And Matt said, do you want to come and see this shield we've found? And I was like, all right, okay. And basically blew my mind. So that's how I ended up involved.
So and this is, I guess, it's also interesting that this was 2 years after it was found as well. That's quite interesting. Again,
3 years. Yeah.
3 years. Yeah, it speaks something about the post-ex and the way the things move in the world of archaeology.
Well, especially with this artifact, because although we found it in 2015, we recognised it as a shield when it was in the ground. Once it's come back to the lab and we were looking at it carefully and thought, this has to be a shield. It was very fragile, very delicate. The actual bark body, perhaps 3 to 4 millimeters thick, and fall apart. It will fall apart while you're looking at it.
Right.
And essentially, we couldn't handle it because it was so fragile. Okay. So we had various components. We had the bark body. We had a woven boss in the middle of the shield. We had a bit of edging, trim, and we had these strange, peculiar laths that we call them of another wood, visible actually in the body of the bark, pushed it. I always say, like imagine a well-bone corset. So actually kind of pushed through the bark, but we really didn't know how those elements articulated and worked with each other. And we didn't, and it went off to conservation. So we did some work. We did some CT scanning at Leicester Royal Infirmary, who were very helpful, and we had some images. But essentially, we had components. We didn't really know how it worked, and then we mounted this with Mike Bamforth, the wood technology expert. We mounted a project to actually rebuild the shields based on the components that we knew we had, and we used a Dutch experimental archaeologist called Diederik Pomstra, who was absolutely fantastic. And I set up a weekend of June 15th, 16th in 2018, and we remade some shields then. And Rachel came along and saw that. And it was really in the process of doing that that we really understood that much better how these separate elements actually articulated and combined to make something credible and so much more than just simply the flat pieces of waterlogged wood that were in the ground.
Yeah. Well, and actually, it's interesting because the way that this was reported in especially the newspaper headlines and articles that I read, was such that people were expressing surprise. And the reason why I sort of glibly said at the beginning, or confirmation rather, of certain things, is that presumably, Rachel, you must have found this exciting because it kind of confirmed a style of warfare that's hinted at in, for example, the writings of Caesar and others, and also this idea of certain people on chariots, fast moving, and this kind of type of combat. Whereas I guess for many people, in certainly in terms of general exposure to especially Iron Age combat, you'll have things like the Battersea Shield, which is a great big hunk of metal. And so how did you find this, I guess, this element of coming face to face with this remade shield, and how it interacted with all these other ideas in terms of votive offerings and also practical use in terms of Iron Age warfare?
So I think the way to start talking about that is to say that when I was told it was a bark shield, I've done experimental work with wooden shields, and they're very effective, but they're very heavy. And I was dubious about a bark shield being effective, and I was dubious even about how you worked bark, because it's not a material I have a lot of experience with. And
so you weren't sure if they were barking up the wrong tree?
Oh, that's bad.
Sorry, go on.
The weekend last year when Matt had everybody over to try and make one completely changed my mind about it as a material, in that you can see the way that this kind of completely flexible and living material, when it comes off the tree, when you've put the laths through it and you've force dried it over a fire, it becomes hard and effective. And that weekend we fired some arrows, not like appropriate arrows for the Iron Age, but much more recent arrows at them, and we watched them not really pierce into it at all. We watched them bounce back off. And that was the moment for me when it kind of became like, I can see how this works. And now you get this thing where we tell people we found a bark shield and they all look really dubious, and then you show them the replica and they're convinced, because what becomes clear is that it works. And in particular for me, the experiments I've done with wooden Bronze Age replica shields have all been with alder and stuff like that, and they're really heavy. They're not the kind of thing you could run around with. No. Whereas the bark shields, they're pretty light, and you can lift them up and move them around really actively. And I think that also plays into one of our problems when we think about defense in kind of combat in prehistory, is that we tend to think of it that you're hiding behind something, but a shield is really an active piece of weaponry, in that when you're using it effectively, you're able to protect yourself, but that means moving with it, and moving with it is much easier if it's really light. I think Matt's been able to draw out some really interesting comparisons with the Battersea Shield, actually, that are worth thinking about.
Definitely, we think I think that something that really hit home in the process of analysing the bits, the pieces, the components. There was one piece that was a bit overlooked, and that was the handle. And because the shield was so delicate and it was so we couldn't handle it. It was only after conservation that it come back that we actually took this thing apart and really saw the handle for what it was. And the handle, we've got half the handle. It's a piece of winter wood, and it's tapered, it's chamfered on the face that meets the bark. And that said to me, on the basis that the handle was symmetrical, that the shield was curved. Now, most shields that we find have either been crumpled up or they're flat. So we were kind of fighting a received wisdom that shields are flat.
Yeah.
And although actually, if you look at the literature and you look at the few organic wooden shields that there is curvature there.
Yeah.
I think it might not be plundering, but one of the Irish ones, the older plank shield, that's actually curved both longitudinally and cross section. It curves towards the. Now the handle being chamfered said to me that the shield is curved, but we also knew that the bark, that the outer face of the bark was the inside of the shield, and the inside of the tree was the outside of the shield. So if it's curved, then the bark is being curved against what it wants to naturally do.
Yeah.
And so this fed into our remaking of actually how are we going to make them dry so that the shield has got that kind of curve. And I think that those elements have actually, and we've got one of willow and one of alder. They're both effectively curved, but curved slightly differently. One's curved longitudinally one way and laterally the other, and it's vice versa on the alder shield. But essentially, that curve puts tension into the body of the shield, and the laths mean it holds that curve, and the trim, the edging trim, also means it holds that curve. We did experiments, or at least Diederik Pomstra, this great experimental archaeologist from the Netherlands, and I can't sing his praises highly enough because he was absolutely instrumental in what we did. But he produced pieces of shield, pieces of bark without these elements, so without the edging trim and without the laths, and they both everything distorted, and you could understand. Do you want to
get a prop.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, without a doubt.
You can see really effectively what's going on. So here we've got a small experimental piece.
Yeah.
The piece of willow bark. That is the outside of the tree, and this is what you'd call the corky layer.
Yeah.
It's had laths of hawthorn, which these pieces here actually fed through the body of the bark, being dried with strings across those pieces of hawthorn to put that curve in it, because that's what it needs. Okay.
No, interesting. Just interesting. It's so when you were talking about other materials, I immediately thought of things like leather or even linen can be used in these sorts of purposes. But interestingly, that's an element of this material that you can't replicate with leather. Is actually feeding something within the material itself. So smoothly through that tunnel. I mean, how was that? How was those tunnels produced in terms of feeding the
They were effectively produced with a knife.
Right.
We used steel knives and spikes. But effectively, Diederik he used a knife, a sheath knife, if you like, or a hunting knife, and a spike, and a wooden billet, and that's probably about all he used. So we held the bark down effectively on a big workbench. We've got essentially a cross section of a big tree that we're using as a workbench, and we pushed the knife into the side to actually cut a channel.
Right.
And then we prepared our laths, which are of hawthorn, we think, and we rounded the end, and we introduced that into the side of the split and tapped it through, and that's how we did it. The laths were visible. They're partly so this effectively replicates what we found in the ground, with the laths partly visible in places. They're all I call them like inverse belt loops. So you had another chance of actually putting your knife in and cutting another channel.
Yeah.
You didn't have to have a knife that was the full length of the shield. And perhaps if I go a more full-size replica, then you can kind of understand more there. It's been done very carefully, and this one was actually made by a chap called Paul Windridge, a mate of mine who's a very crafty guy, and he was also excellent to have on board. So he made this shield. So effectively, you can put these laths through the bark with a knife, with a mallet, perhaps with a flat surface, or at least a surface to hold the bark onto, and with a great deal of care. If you know what you're aiming for, then it is possible. It was something that we really didn't know how it was going to work. And I'll have to mention that the actual in-the-ground evidence says that some of the laths are actually on diagonals.
Right.
And we went for the simple version and put our laths in on the horizontal.
Would a diagonal introduce a compound curve then, potentially?
It could well introduce compound curve, but they're also the laths are not continuous. We went for continuous laths, one edge to the other, and the evidence says is that they're not continuous. But I think because our experiments, we knew that we were effectively starting from nothing.
Zero.
Yeah. And could we actually get laths into the bark? For a more simple explanation, I'd really like to experiment again to do shorter laths. It may be that the laths are actually answering a problem in the bark. They're actually introduced to do something in particular in a certain place, and we haven't really, we don't fully understand that yet. No. We know the laths stop the deformation, and that was kind of the main point. So effectively, this shield has got laths.
No edge.
But no edge, and so the edge is distorted, but the body has got some control over it.
Yeah.
And then another one, which has got edging pieces.
Yeah.
That's distorted all over the place. So you suddenly get it. That's what they're doing. They're actually controlling the deformation as it dries, and that's what these components are about.
Wow. So the
just to come back, so where we started from, which was the Battersea Shield. So if people Google the Battersea Shield, look at the Battersea Shield, and look at its plan form, you see the slightly figure of 8 shape. It's narrow in the middle, but it's flat. And both our shields, because they have curves, if you look at this one, it's not a lot, but it is wasted, but it's a rectangular piece of bark, and that's what curves do. So sorry, that's just kind of bringing that back on.
No, sorry. Okay, you started another train of thought to me there for a second. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But just going back briefly then to the replica there you have. So that's the woven boss you were talking about in the middle.
Yeah.
What does this say about the function and the efficacy of these things? In so much as, so for example, I spent a lot of time working at the Jorvik Viking Centre, handling shields and things, and bosses. People often had these interesting conversations, especially with the public, about bosses, where there'd be this idea that you hit people with the boss, but then you get someone go, oh no. You see, if you go to hit someone with the boss, you lose. You can't see who you're punching, because then they can chop your knees off or something. So the use of the boss, the consensus eventually was more or less just that it was purely to defend your hand, more or less, and to make you more confident in wielding the shield. But a woven boss fascinates me. I mean, does it have an implication for the use of the shield, in so much as that's the thing, your hand is closest to whatever's coming at you behind the boss, I guess?
So, I mean, I've got my take on that is that boss, essentially you need a hole in the bark
second replica
for the handle. So this is the replica made of alder bark.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now, in order to hold your piece of bark to defend yourself, you need a handle.
Yeah.
And you need to attach that handle to the shield. So unless you're actually going to offset it a long way off the bark, the handle is going to be close to the body, and therefore you need to cut a hole in the middle of the shield in which your knuckles can go.
Yeah, well, which also actually helps hold it. I've definitely held sort of experimental replicas with a handle that comes away from the body, and it tends to pivot on that handle away from you. It's not very easy to hold. So I guess, that helps with balance, I guess, doesn't it?
So it's a kind of simple solution to how to hold on it. Yeah. And then you've got a hole in the shield. You need something to cover it. Yeah. So my understanding of these is that it is a protection for the hand, protection. Knuckles, effectively. Okay. Quite how effective these would be, I'm not sure we've totally got the boss right in understanding how it's actually been made. I think we've identified a willow rod, and we've identified 14 circuits, and we've identified that the willow rod has been bound with a flat fibre, either bast fibre or rush or grass. But I think there actually might be some more components within the body of the boss. It might be more of a compound fibre that actually has got a little bit more strength to it. Right. So we totally understand how effective the boss would be against someone trying to hit your hand.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the thing is, in that sense, it's reminiscent of other forms of armour. So, for example, a chain shirt isn't actually that good at actually stopping, say, a spear, but it gives you confidence against cuts. It makes you that bit more effective, and so it's all about percentages in terms of what you're going to be doing on a battlefield.
Yeah.
But I guess just going back to you, Rachel, or maybe the two of you together possibly might be able to answer this. And so much as what does this mean in terms of how we should think of, especially Iron Age altercations, shall we say, if not full-on warfare? Because the Battersea Shield, in that sense, sounds like it could be a metallic, symbolic version of what you're looking at there, and therefore maybe we should be throwing out this idea of this Roman testudo facing up against these Iron Age warriors with sort of metal shields or something like that, or those flat oval shields that you often see reenactors using, for example. How does this specific equipment change the picture that we should have in our minds? Because one aspect that came up in the conversation that I had with a colleague was this idea of returning to a more formalized champion-based warfare that you sometimes hear about in the Iron Age. The idea that actually maybe large-scale conflict wasn't really something that this sort of equipment was built for. It was much more, as you say, lightweight and moving in a way that isn't unit-based, if that makes any sense. So does this change how people should be thinking about this time?
I think the first thing to kind of say on that is that it's something that Julia Farley from the British Museum has said about the Enderby Shield, is that it's an absolutely extraordinary find, but it's probably actually the norm, and these things are probably incredibly common.
Yeah.
That's the way to begin rethinking these kinds of things, to think about that there were probably lots of these, and they were probably something that lots of people had access to. I think rethinking how you think about Iron Age warfare is a bit of a slightly different task in that sense. If I go back to what I'm best at and I think about the Bronze Age, I think kind of the way in which we know that Bronze Age weapons respond when you're using them. I've often wondered about kind of the idea of, I guess, your kind of one person on one person battle, and maybe the winner's decided in advance, and that kind of stuff kind of reshape it. Certainly moved away for the majority of the Bronze Age in Britain from the kind of idea of pitched warfare at that time. We only have one kind of real site in Europe that shows us that kind of masses of people going at each other in combat in that manner. What it says for the Iron Age is slightly harder for me as a Bronze Age person to be certain of. I think it talks about moving more swiftly perhaps than people had imagined. I think that's definitely something to take away from it. I think thinking more about the style of combat that this kind of thing requires or kind of like indicates needs a wider set of experiments to think about that. So at the minute, just building the shield was a massive amount of work, and we've learned so much from it. Thinking about adding this shield into the armories that we know people had in the Iron Age would be the next step. And in my own work on the Bronze Age, it's only when you've got all the weapons together and you think about how they respond when you fight with them that you begin to get the picture of how it is that people are fighting. And I think thinking about a bark shield in relation to iron spearheads and stuff like that is what we need to do kind of for that next step. I don't know what Matt thinks on that.
Yes, and also and potentially the bone ones as well. This kind of the bone, tibia, and mammal points that might well have been spearheads. I guess broadly it's it's another slap in the face for kind of metal archaeology and inorganic archaeology about how essentially so much of our knowledge and our understanding is born on 19th century and later finds and the inorganic stuff that we find, and that's what our brains focus on. And you don't need metal. You can do it with other stuff. And in fact, if you haven't got metal, you can go into the woods. You need knowledge and understanding. You don't necessarily need metal.
No.
That's so again, it's a big reminder on how much our knowledge is based upon the skim of stuff that we find, and how you've got to keep your mind open and remember the organic.
Well, and funnily enough, and I am conscious that certainly Rachel needs to head off very soon. But funnily enough, it reminds me of the fact that people are often surprised, and this may come back to a nomenclature issue. People are often surprised that the Iron Age isn't chock-a-block with iron for everything. People aren't wearing iron shoes, for example. Although in the Bronze Age, people are using stone arrowheads and so on and so forth. And I guess in this instance, what we have is that extra texture that is often lost, certainly in that sort of Hollywood kind of view of history. Mm-hmm. But also, I can't help but wonder whether there's an element here of the Iron Age that we need to be careful not to rush to romanticize, in so much as I imagine there's going to be lots of people going, wanting or feeling as though this sort of, another word that people sometimes use with the Iron Age is Celtic, sort of in touch with the woods and forests. We don't want to sort of, I guess, start talking about like an elvish people, basically, in that sense. But I guess reintroducing this softer element and reworking of materials is fascinating. I suppose my final question for you is along the lines of, what was it like to actually manipulate the bark, in so much as it sounds like it's almost like especially I guess in a literal way, it's a bit like leather. It's the skin of an organism that you're manipulating and letting it dry, and in drying its properties change. Was it similar? Did you have to scrape away the equivalent of animal hair and put it in the sun for a bit?
The evidence says that the outside of the shield was the thickest part, and the actual middle of the shield had been reduced. Its thickness had been reduced. So we did the inside edge of the bark was pretty clean. Had success with willow, and we had success with alder. The alder when it came off was red, orangey red, an ochre orangey red, and the sap was very ochre, the same colour. It left orange stains over your hands.
Like blood.
Like blood.
Right.
And
now, interesting. Do you think that? I mean, would you be ever tempted to bring in a sort of an element there in terms of colour? Because colour is another texture that's often lost in terms of how we talk about this.
Absolutely. And with both Julia Farley from the British Museum and Mel Giles, who's been involved in the project as well, have talked about how important red is. And one of the things that I don't know how well it came across in the press stuff is that there is decoration on the shield, and that decoration is red. And then kind of remarkable experience when we made the replica, where it was like it was bleeding almost, like it was all the sap was coming out really red, and it was marking your hands, and you could see where your hands had been on the bark. That kind of, it's the skin of a tree.
Again, it's like tree leather. Sorry, I interrupted you. Come on.
So the inside didn't need much doing to it. The inside, as it peels off the tree, you kind of work it off with your hands, pushing between the bark and the tree. The inside comes off pretty cleanly. The outside, you can reduce down, thinning it down, to actually get rid of some of the corky stuff that you don't want, because that's not flexible. No. Yes, it was. I mean, I wouldn't say I really know about how I'd process leather, but it was definitely you did stuff to it, and it was transformative, because as it dried, it changed.
It's a completely different material dry than it is wet. There was something really, like, for me, maybe I'm naive, but I suspect that most people haven't spent that much time working bark. The difference between, the bark as it was cut off the tree and it was all red and wibbly wobbly and you could bend it, and then the bark after it's been force dried over the fire, where it's hard and you can tap on it and it's brittle and strong, is really quite something. And then the concept that these laths are being put into it as well to give it shape and to make it hold strong is a really kind of fascinating exercise in thinking about materials and kind of how they change and what kind of properties and affordances they offer us. It's a remarkable object.
Okay, cool. And also, I guess that's a handy way to bring things to a close, in so much as it's also a great way to think about how those materials materially should change how we think about this period in history as well. I guess finally, are you at all tempted? This is the second time I've said the word finally, but are you at all tempted to now use this sort of bark anywhere in your lives, in so much as I'm genuinely, in so much as, I mean, we've just had a new shed, for example, and I can't help but wonder whether if I'd been working with this bark, if I'd been going, well, maybe that would work on the roof, this kind of thing. Is there anything does it make you think about this material differently in terms of now, not just then as well? Or is that a weird question?
It's not that weird.
It's not that weird.
We've spent a lot of time thinking about bark.
It's a good question. I think the thing is when you go to a tree wanting the bark,
yeah,
you only want some of the bark. Most of the bark's got holes in it or blemishes, and you need a lot of woodland to be able to do lots of stuff with bark. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be, but certainly if you'd got access to that kind of resource and you've got a whole large areas of trees, then you could certainly think about using the bark for shelters, for roofs, for other. I mean, we know so little because we found so little, didn't we? But really, if we looked to the southern hemisphere, you see that they use bark for a whole load of stuff, and we should really be more. Probably need to be more imaginative. We could be more imaginative and actually trying to think. Well, actually, where mice Iron Age people have used bark more. So I think that's probably a challenge, isn't it, about where you could use it. Yeah.
I suppose if you just found a little piece of plastic or a Lego brick in like 6,000 years' time, extrapolating how and where we use plastic today and all the different ways that we use it, it would be, and the different qualities of plastic. Yeah. Anyway, that's something for another time. Again, thank you so much for your time today. As ever, until next time, everyone at home, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.